So saying I went to space camp seemed just nerdy and cool enough for this audience, so I hope I picked that fun fact okay. I'm not good at watching people read a bio or your LinkedIn. It just feels super awkward, and then to get up here and feel like you're living your best Britney Spears fantasies just doesn't seem quite right. So thank you so much, Claire, for the wonderful introduction, and to Atlassian for having me. As Claire mentioned, I'm the Chief People Officer at HubSpot, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a CRM company and a marketing, sales, and services growth platform for many of the world's small and medium-sized businesses. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we, as very proud Atlassian customers, I'm joined by some of my colleagues here from HubSpot, create a culture of transparency through our use of Confluence. And so first, I'm going to actually take us back a little bit. I'm going to do a little bit of a Throwback Tuesday sort of situation, if I can get the clicker to work, which could maybe not happen. All right. You guys manually advance that? I'll talk. We'll figure this out. It's going to be fine. So for a little bit of a Throwback Tuesday, I have a photo, which will soon appear magically, of HubSpot's IPO, which happened in October 2014. And we were unclear at that juncture how we were going to grow as an organization. But at the time, I was a marketer. So I actually ran internal and external communications for our IPO. And as Claire mentioned, I was a self-described, self-declared, at least it wasn't just me. That makes me feel a little bit better that it wasn't a user error. But I was a marketer. And 3 days after our IPO, on the day when we weren't sure what was going to happen with our company, as a public company, all that kind of good stuff, our co-founder, Dharmesh Shah, asked me if I would have dinner. And he's a self-proclaimed introvert. And so if he asks you to have dinner just one-on-one, you know that something is sort of on his mind. And he asked me if I would be willing to take over HubSpot's culture full-time. Now, I thought that seemed like a really good way to be unemployed in a year or so, because who wants to hire someone who focuses full-time on culture? At the time, really no one did. And so I said, thank you so much for thinking of me, but I'm busy. I would like to be a marketable employee for many years to come, so I'm going to have to politely decline. Next day, I get an email from our CEO and co-founder, Brian Halligan, saying, hey, I have a great idea for you. Would love for you to consider taking over our culture full-time. And again, I said no. And perhaps it was our co-founder's persistence or maybe a little bit of post-IPO hangover. But on the third time, I said, you know what, I'll try it and see how that goes. And so my warning for all of you is that I am not a career HR professional. I'm a recovering marketer and still sort of identify as a marketer as heart, even though I now run all of HubSpot's people operations and have actually been in HR for longer than I've been in marketing at HubSpot. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we've used trust and transparency within our culture to scale our organization. And we've done that in a few different meaningful ways. So as we've expanded, one of the things that's also on this magical slide, which will show up soon, is all of our locations. So when we went public as an organization, we had exactly 2 locations. Cambridge, which is our headquarters, and then Dublin, Ireland, where we are now over 500 people. Since then, we've scaled to over 2,600 employees in over 8 locations, along with over 150 employees who work remotely on a regular basis. And so just think about that from a scale perspective, going from 450 employees to 2,600 employees, scaling locations, languages, and culture. One critical ingredient to knowing where you're going on that front is having a shared language and vernacular around what your culture actually stands for. So how many people have ever heard of HubSpot's culture code? Cool. Basically my colleagues and then 3 other people. Thank you for that. That's okay. It wasn't a loaded question. If you're going to read one culture deck that's available on the internet today, I suggest that you read the Netflix culture deck. It's one of the most iconic culture codifications, in my opinion, in the entire world. If you're going to read 2 culture decks, I actually suggest you read the Netflix deck twice. It's that good and still that influential and still that ahead of its time. But if you do have time to read a 3rd one, I'd highly recommend that you check out HubSpot's culture code. Now, a few warnings. Thank you. We're good. Go to the next slide there. Perfect. We're rocking and rolling. Should I manually advance?
I'm sorry, what?
Should I manually advance?
Well,
great, we're working on it. We're great. We're good to go. So the culture code is available at culturecode.com, and it has 128 slides, but don't worry, there's an average of 2 to 3 words on every slide, so it's not so bad. It's really quick, plain reading for your trip home. But when people talk about our culture code, it's not the deck that I'm really proud of. It's the fact that we took the time to align on what mattered to us as an organization. So, how many of your organizations have a document that is available internally and externally that codifies what your culture stands for? Awesome. Okay, so I see like maybe a third of people have that. That's fantastic, and it's becoming a growing trend for businesses. I would love to see that next year look more like 75 to 100%. Here's why. When you're hiring at a fast-growing organization, one of the things that happens is that what you mean by certain words or terminologies tends to become a bit of a game of telephone. What I define as humble or empathetic, which are two of our values at HubSpot, might be different than what my colleagues see. And so when we're interviewing or screening for talent, how we interpret those values can differ wildly. And so as a result, taking the time to align on what you really care about as an organization is absolutely paramount. Now, one of the things I've noticed is with more and more companies defining what their culture means, there are more and more companies actually playing it really safe in the culture space. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people send me their culture decks to review, and they'll say, Katie, what do you think of this? And what I do when people send me their decks is I actually ask them to pass the yoga studio test. So the yoga studio test goes something like this. If you take your deck and you cover up all the branding and the name of the company and the description of what you do, could it actually be a description of the company culture of a yoga studio? And chances are, it probably could be. So let me give you an example. I've never met a founder or an organization that doesn't want to hire exceptional people. So I've never seen a culture deck that says, we actually want to hire suboptimal people who work an average amount of time and create reasonably effective work. And so in an attempt to appeal to everyone, most people actually regress to the mean. They try not to offend anyone. They don't want to step on anyone's toes. They don't want a certain division to be mad or upset. They don't want a specific location to be left out. And so once everything interesting about the deck is edited, it's ready for a consensus ship to market. Does that sound familiar to anyone? I see some nodding heads. And so if you're at the stage of your organization where you're thinking about codifying your culture, my ask of you is don't regress to the mean. I want to work, and most people want to work, at a place that's interesting, compelling, and differentiated in a really crowded talent market. And so if you just say you want to hire people and help them grow, and you want interesting people and to create a safe space for people to be themselves, all those are wonderful things, but everyone else is saying it. So say something interesting that gives you a sense for what type of people are going to grow and really succeed and thrive in your organizations. How are we doing, guys? Great, back on track. All right, so we're good. Yeah, we're good. This is all gonna be great. So show of hands, how many of you work for an organization that's gonna hire at least one person this year? Just one person? Cool, okay, great. We're all in good company, we're in the right place. That's a great sign. Turns out we're all not alone. I work for a company that wants to hire some people too. And it turns out that our lives are about to get harder, not easier. So about 3/4 of employers are having a difficult time finding skilled candidates, and recruiters are feeling the pain too. So 74% of recruiters think that hiring is going to get more competitive, not less so, in the year ahead. I would also love to hire those 26% of recruiters who think it's going to get better, not harder, because they are serial optimists, and that's a wonderful thing to be. But point being, we operate in a really, really crowded talent market. And so if you want to stick out, you have to be willing to be a little bit transparent. Let's talk a little bit about why transparency matters. So if you look at the screens throughout the entire conference, you'll see some great new data from Atlassian on why trust and transparency matters. But in the absence of having that for this deck today, let's start with just the basics. So over 70% of consumers want to trust the brand, and they want to do some research before they get there. So one thing is when people say they're hiring people, they often say, we just redid our job site. It's amazing. Well, if someone's on your job site, chances are they're pretty far down the consideration process and thinking about your company. And so you actually need to engage them well above that stage at on your jobs page to give them a sense of what it's like to work at your organization. 81% of people want brands to be transparent. Now, that's not that crazy. That feels roughly right to me. The thing that kills me is that it's higher of the expectations they have of themselves and of their families. So if you think about that for just 1 second, I want the brand I interact with to be more transparent with me than my own mother. Just think about that for a second. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do as we finish talking today is we have 40 minutes. And my goal here is not to preach on and on about all the great things we've done at HubSpot. We've actually made a ton of mistakes and learned from them. My challenge to each of you is to think of one thing when you leave here that you can do to make your company more transparent. That could even be at the team level, that could be at the location level. So oftentimes people say to me, yep, Katie, that must be great for you. You've been at HubSpot for 7 years, you're a C-level executive, you have founders who really believe in this, easy for you to say. And so one of the things I would do is take that negativity out of your mind and think instead about one thing you can do from wherever you are, in whatever role you're in, to make your company and your organization more transparent. Does that sound reasonable? Fantastic. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we care about transparency, and one of the other negative things that people often say is they say, great, Katie, it must be easy for you because you work in tech. And the reality is that some of the world's oldest education institutions have already taken some of the things that make them special and put it online. So MIT, where I'm proud to be an alum, put their entire curriculum online. Harvard put most of their coursework online and makes it completely available. Why? Because the world that we're operating in is getting more transparent, not less so. So if you're an organization who's sitting here and is thinking to say to me, I'm in banking, I'm in finance, I'm in cybersecurity, and so we're an organization that can't afford to be as transparent about as HubSpot is, I would encourage you to think just the opposite. If the world's oldest education institutions can do it, you can at least nudge yourself a little bit closer on the transparency spectrum. Finally, how many people in the room are familiar with Glassdoor and have ever researched an employer, either your current employer or a future employer on Glassdoor? Great. So have we. We are proud to be an engaged Glassdoor employer and respond to employee reviews. How many people have heard of Blind? So if you haven't heard of Blind, more of you are going to hear about it. Just a heads up, it's a bit of a time suck, so this will take longer if you go down this route than reading our culture deck. But Blind essentially allows employees to talk about companies, salary, managers, you name it, on an anonymous app where there's very little verification and very little context. And so I reference Blind not to endorse them and not to scare all of you, but instead to remind you that conversations are happening at virtual water coolers everywhere, even if you're not present. And so wouldn't you rather be a part of that conversation than be absent from it? So when people send me negative Glassdoor reviews, which they do often, I respond to all of them, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. I often say to people, the chance to respond to a negative review is a chance to show a candidate that we care, even when, and especially when, the review is negative. So if you're someone who's thinking you can hire from Glassdoor, from Blind, from all the different apps out there that give candidates and employees more power, I would encourage you to think differently. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why transparency matters to us at HubSpot. And I'm going to start with first principles. So the first reason that we actually believe the transparency is so important is we fundamentally believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now, we've been fortunate over our 12-year history as a company to have some really big wins and successes. But one of the things that's challenging as you scale and grow is that everyone thinks it's unicorns and rainbows all the time. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that it's not. We've made some big mistakes. We've made some mishires. We've gotten some bad press. We've had some challenging execution or rollouts. We've had all the same challenges that any fast-growing company has. And time after time after time, in spite of every one of those mistakes, our Employee Net Promoter Score survey, which we do every single quarter anonymously, has actually gone up. And the reason for that is very simple. Your employees don't expect perfection. They expect humility, they expect trust, and they expect transparency. If and when we have a failure of a big rollout, a failure of initiative, or something we do wrong, or we miss a big issue in a location or team, our employees hear directly from us and see their comments live on our Confluence instance, which we refer to as our wiki. They see their feedback in real time. So how many people have ever taken an employee engagement survey at an employer? Could be current, could be past. Cool. So I used to work for a big multinational company, and I thought that employee engagement surveys were where feedback went to die. Because basically, you'd fill out a form, and in roughly a year, HR would come back and they say, we heard your feedback, there are a few small changes we're going to make, and oh, by the way, there are cupcakes in the lobby. Does that sound roughly familiar? Anything hard-hitting, hard to hear, personal about the management team was redacted. At HubSpot, we do the exact opposite. All of our employee feedback, including all the raw comments, are posted to the wiki every single quarter. So you can imagine there are days when it's not super fun for me to post a comment saying, I thought Katie was actually really terrible at the company meeting, or I thought her team did a really bad job, or my experience with the candidate was not great. But the reason that we believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant is that transparency is most important when things are hard. It's the easiest when things are good, but it's most important when things are hard. So this is the first principle that we come back to for transparency at HubSpot. Now, why else do we care about it? In a super crowded talent market, it turns out that most of your employees have aspirations above and beyond the job that they're considering with your organization. So let's say, for example, I'm hiring an entry-level sales rep or an entry-level engineer. Chances are that he or she is interested at some point down the line in considering a career in entrepreneurship, maybe starting her own business, being a CEO, being a C-level executive at a bigger organization. Whatever their aspirations are, chances are they want to do more than just the job that they're applying for. One of the consequences that's really positive of transparency is you're helping your employees learn and grow on the job. So many of you are familiar with the framework of 70-20-10 of how employees learn on the job. So roughly 70% is from actual work, and roughly 10% is informal classroom learning opportunities. We think of our Confluence wiki and our instance and our transparency and our commitment here as a very core part of that 70% of on-the-job learning. So to give you a few examples, we're growing globally, and as a result, that requires a lot more cultural context. And so getting a first-hand account from one of our employees on feedback from a customer in a given region, or a mistake that they made, or an assumption that they built into the product that simply didn't work, allows me, even if I'm in people operations, to make a better, more informed decision as a result of their mistakes. We also host something called the Failure Forum, which we put on our wiki. And basically what the Failure Forum does is it normalizes failure as part of our growth as an organization. So the Failure Forum occurs roughly 3 times a year. And the only rule is it can't be like, you know the job interview question, what's your biggest weakness? And everyone says my biggest weakness is I work too hard. The only rule of Failure Forum is it has to be an actual failure, an actual phenomenal failure. Personal or professional, it can be either one, but you can't just get up there and say, oh, I did something and then it worked out perfectly and it was amazing. It has to be a core failure. And so we post all those things on the company wiki for people to see so that they don't just become better BDRs, engineers, recruiters, systems analysts, whatever the job you have at HubSpot, you don't just get better in that role, you start to actually think like an owner of the business. And in doing so, you create more ownership of your own decisions and of the future of the company. So transparency has the additional corollary benefit of making your employees better entrepreneurs, which we think is a huge win. Second thing is alignment at scale. So I mentioned we've grown like crazy, but not just in terms of the number of employees we have, but also in terms of the number of locations we have as a company. And as it turns out, trying to get vectors aligned is incredibly challenging as you scale and grow. Not to mention you add in a lot of first-time managers, a lot of different levels of experience in tech, a lot of misunderstandings, and it's really easy for people to get off track as far as getting on the same page. And so we use our wiki to help keep people aligned. So at most organizations, if you want to know what, for example, the CEO is working on or what the company's strategy is, chances are you have to attend something like a town hall to get an insight into what he or she is thinking about the organization. At HubSpot, that's available to any employee on her first day, whether you're an intern or our CFO, because we make that available to every single person in your organization. And the direct impact of doing that is that everyone from their first day knows what our 2019 strategy is. They know what I'm working on, even as up to the month. So for example, they can see my April priorities. They know that, for example, I'm coming out here to do a talk, to get some great feedback, to learn and meet some new people. They know that that's on my priority list. They can see our omissions, the things that we're not prioritizing as a business. And as a result, they can pick things to focus on that are core priorities, not omissions. So the very act of posting more allows us to align vectors at scale and not waste as much time retracting work that gets done that is out of line with the scope of where we want to go as a company. The third thing is we care about our customers. I have yet to meet an organization that says they don't. But how do you actually make that real? As it turns out, when you scale, most leaders don't actually solve for themselves. They tend to solve for their own teams. And what I mean by that is you can see a scenario where in the absence of transparency, I start to go, well, people operations really needs a little bit more of that. Our recruiting team really needs a little more of that. Nobody in the organization really needs to know that we messed this up. And so it becomes super easy to sell for your team over what your customers and your partners really need. And so setting the default setting to transparency and making sure that everyone knows what everyone else is working on using our Confluence instance is absolutely paramount to making sure that we keep our focus on what's most important to our growth long term, which is our customers. And so what I mean by that is you can't hide from customer feedback. You can't hide from hard questions from our CEO on why we're making assumptions or why we're building a product that isn't, for example, on our roadmap. But everyone gets to ask those questions and learn together, and it keeps our focus as an organization on the people that matter most to our growth long term, which are our customers and our partners globally. And then finally, we're building a foundation of trust. So it turns out that 45% of people say that lack of trust is their biggest issue in work performance, which is pretty astounding when you think about just the output that could come out of that. And so when we think about building trust, we think about leaning into our mistakes, talking about what hasn't worked, having hard discussions, and actually embracing conflict. So one of the best kept secrets of our company wiki is it's actually a place where constructive conflict happens at scale almost daily. So we have created an instrument for people to actively disagree with every single member of our management team on issues that are really big and seemingly really small. And so as a result, you don't need to go to a constructive conflict class. You don't need to go to a first-time manager class on how you can actually have an active debate at HubSpot. You're encouraged to do so from the first day you start by engaging in debate on our wiki. So enough about us. What I want to talk about now is a little bit more about how you all can be transparent and some of the actual tactics we use to be transparent at HubSpot. So to give you some nitty-gritty statistics on how we use the wiki at HubSpot, more than 95% of our employees log in to our wiki on a regular basis, and more than 40% are creating, contributing, or commenting on content on a regular basis. So just think about that for a second. At most organizations I've ever worked with, the content comes from the top. The mandates come from the top, comes from roughly 7% of the organization. And what we've done instead is democratized content creation. And so we really want managers, directors, individual contributors, new employees engaging early and often and getting off the sidelines and into the game. And in doing so, what you'll see to the right is that many of our new and most popular posts come from new employees who have new perspectives, fresh ideas to share, often come from our global locations, and maybe they don't get to see our co-founders in the midst because they're not located in our Cambridge office, but they do get an opportunity to engage them in thoughtful debate or discussion really early on in their HubSpot career. So the question I often ask for people when I ask about their internal communication systems is, how do you communicate? And oftentimes they'll say things like email, they'll say things like Slack. They're all great options, and we use them all at HubSpot to communicate too. But very few of those mediums democratize content access and creation in the same way that our Confluence instance and our wiki does. And so one of the things I love about HubSpot is you are as likely to knock our CEO out of the top spot as you are to be at the very bottom of the popular page. And we very intentionally work with our internal comms team and our collaboration team to ensure that that stays the same as we grow and scale. It would have been the easiest decision in the world for us to say, no, we'd rather make our content more top-down, only C-level execs, only people at this level can post in this page, and we do the exact opposite. And the direct result is we get amazing content from some of our support folks. So customer support at HubSpot, one of our remote customer support reps is one of the top posts on the wiki right now. And you know what he wrote about? His day-to-day routine and how he optimizes it for success and impact for our customers, including the apps he uses, the meditation he does during the day. Our remote employees went crazy because they were able to get access. They have a great Slack channel through which they all convene, but he basically shared some best practices from his day. And oh, by the way, our entire management team got to see it and empathize with his firsthand experience. That's powerful as you democratize content across your organization. Now, on the opposite side of things, one of the other reasons that people choose to work at HubSpot is they feel that we're a very flat organization. So our co-founder, Dharmesh, does a series of posts, a blog, called Ponderings. And basically, he does exactly that. He ponders on our wiki. So on the left, one of the things you'll see is he explains how he prioritizes his own pet rocks. I've never worked for a founder that doesn't have some form of pet rock, some things that they care about in a way that might be a little over the top or feel a little personal sometimes. And so Dharmesh shared with our entire organization, hey, if I email you and say this is my pet rock, this is actually what I mean by that. This is what you should do about it. And sometimes the answer is actually nothing. So the pet rock format is sort of one of those things where you're like, okay, cool. If I'm a new employee in the Singapore office, I get a sense of how our quirky co-founder thinks. And on the right is something much more personal. So like many tech companies, we want to be more diverse and inclusive as we grow. And one of my proudest days at HubSpot was when our co-founder Dharmesh, who's incredibly, incredibly private, posted this on our company wiki. And what he talked about is how he's always been different. He's been different as an immigrant. He's been different as an introvert. He's been different as someone who identifies as Indian American but wanted to be a great public speaker. So wanted to figure out how he, presented his identity as Dharmesh Shah and also improved as a public speaker and also fit in but also stood out. And all those tensions that so many people who have their first experiences in tech are experiencing on a regular basis. Not surprisingly, this is one of our most popular wiki posts. And our community of color at HubSpot really, really responded to this with massive fanfare because they said it was so cool to see a co-founder speak from such a vulnerable and personal place. So I've talked a lot about the work benefits and the revenue benefits and the growth and the customer impact of our wiki. But I would also say that there's a real personal benefit in democratizing content because you get the chance to get up close and personal with the human element of your colleagues that you work with every day. And doing so can help any organization, and has helped ours, become more diverse and inclusive as we grow. So as you're thinking about your organization, what you can do, so as I said, one thing was the challenge. I'm going to help you get there. First one's a pretty easy one. Leave here and apply to your own company. So what do I mean by that? I haven't applied to a job at HubSpot in 7 years, and last year I went online. I tried to do it on my mobile phone, tried to do it from my iPhone when I was actually hopping on a flight. And what I found was a surprising amount of empathy for our candidates in terms of what they could access, how easy the experience was, and I basically sent a whole note to my team with all the things I wish I knew as a candidate if I were applying for a job on people operations at HubSpot. Now, you cannot, when you do this exercise, assume that you have all the latent knowledge that you already have about your company or organization. What you can do is do a Google search for that information and see how readily available it is. At most organizations, that information is only readily available on the job site, not on social media, not on blog posts, not on employee-generated content. And so if you're thinking about embracing transparency a little bit more as an organization, I encourage you to start by applying to your own organization first. Second, start small. So one of the things I always do is I think about what we don't share. So I'll give you a few examples. At HubSpot, we share our board decks with all of our employees, all of whom are designated insiders as a public company. So we share our board decks. It's pretty incredible. We also share compensation bands. What we don't share is personal information and personal compensation. So to give you an example, my compensation is not posted internally at HubSpot. So I say that because I don't think that you need to make everything radically transparent to reach the level of transparency that your employees trust. But rather than getting defensive and telling me all the things that your organization currently shares, instead think about 3 things that you currently don't. And then think about what could happen if you did. So oftentimes what happens when we do that is that people start thinking about all the horrible things that could happen. So you can imagine there was a pretty awkward meeting before we went public where we sat down with our bankers and our lawyers and we said, we're actually going to share our board decks, our financials, our monthly results, our performance, all that kind of good stuff with all of our employees. And they said, well, with all of your employees, you mean not your interns, only directors, only people who have filled out all this different format, only after an SEC training, all these things. And by the time they got finished, our CEO said, I'm tired just thinking about all that. No, all of them will get access to that information. And you can imagine, I think our bankers thought long and hard about whether we were crazy. Our lawyers thought long and hard about whether we were crazy. And sure enough, 5 years later, as a public company, we certainly have instances where our employees don't exercise the best judgment. But we also certainly have instances where the upside of sharing all that information has made our employees, our company, our customers, and our partners better. So rather than thinking about all the catastrophic, horrible things that could happen if you shared just 2 more things with your employees, instead think about all the wonderful things that could happen if people had access to just a little tiny bit more information and context for their day-to-day job. And then finally, embrace vulnerability. So I mentioned earlier Dharmesh's post. I also mentioned our failure forum. Some of my favorite posts on our company wiki are things that did not go well. So I'll give you a few examples. After our IPO, one of the things we talked about was the things that we learned from the experience, things that went well, things that we communicated well, and we asked our employees for feedback on all of that. When we do a product launch, one of the things we share is not just all the great things and the accolades and the great coverage. We say these are things that we could have done better in the organization. And I'll give you a personal example. When I got back from my HubSpot sabbatical, so we offer a month away from work for every 5 years you work at HubSpot. And when I got back from my sabbatical, I shared with everyone that I've been skipping Savasana. So for those of you who are yoga fans, I've been skipping the relaxation and recharging part of work for the better part of the last 7 years that I've worked at HubSpot. And so I talked about how I'm building in more self-care and a little bit more time to rest, recharge, and relax, and posted it to the entire company. And you can imagine, a part of me was like, people are going to think I don't work hard enough. People are going to think I went on sabbatical and did like the Eat, Pray, Love thing and have lost my mind a little bit. That's okay. But what we've actually done is created a space for employees to do the same. And in doing so, and in being a little bit vulnerable, we've created space for people to talk about mental health. We've created space for people to talk about personal challenges and things that they've gone through in their home life that they bring to work. And that, at its core, is how we create empathy at HubSpot and how we've built a culture where our employees build trust and transparency through every interaction we have. So what I'm going to do is stop there and take